9 years since its release, and Grand Theft Auto V jumps to a whole new console generation with the enhanced PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and S Edition. 9 years. I can't believe it's been that long, honestly. Just look at how well the game holds up. Everything you're seeing here is pure PS5 and Series X footage, native 4K in the game's new fidelity mode with ray trace shadows enabled. Developer Rockstar North's choice to sell GTA 5 once again on new consoles for a separate price tag, rather than a free upgrade to owners of the PS4 and Xbox One versions, is a curious one. Still, for a breakdown of the upgrade itself over the last-gen PS4 release and comparison to the maxed out PC version, check out Alex's video on the channel. But for today, for this video, the focus is squarely on PS5 and Xbox Series X. How do these premium machines compare in image quality, in settings? How do they hold to 60 FPS in their performance modes? And lastly, what of loading times, a key upgrade promised in the new edition? Let's find out. The basics first. On PS5 and Series X, we get HDR support. We also get 3 graphics modes, and depending on which mode you choose, you can enable ray tracing support in the form of RT shadows. 60 frames per second is also possible in the game for the first time on console. A true native 4K is enabled as well. We get texture upgrades, boosted draw distances, and lastly on PS5 specifically, we get support for haptic feedback and adaptive triggers. On the surface, there's a lot to love here, so let's begin at the beginning. Starting at the game's menus, you're greeted with 3 modes in its options: Fidelity, Performance RT, and Performance. More on these in a second. First, let's resume our game here on Fidelity mode to a matching spot at Trevor's home to see how quickly GTA 5 loads now. Fast travelling with a taxi or retrying missions takes no time at all, so in fact, the only significant loading screen is this first boot up to the world. Loading to Trevor's trailer, for example, takes Xbox Series X 20 seconds, only a few seconds ahead of the 23-second result on PS5. It's a solid result on both sides, and honestly, a marked improvement over the 2 minutes plus on the last-gen PS4 edition, as Alex has covered in his video. So far, so good. With that out of the way, let's turn to the modes. You get 3 modes on PS5 and Series X alike, and with 0 descriptions in-game, it falls on Rockstar's blog posts online to even vaguely understand what each does. So let's explain what's really going on. First, we have the Fidelity mode, which is your honest-to-goodness native 4K option. Every test shows this is a proper fixed 4K2 on PS5 and Series X with no dynamic scaling, at least in evidence so far. Which makes sense given we saw no signs of DRS in Red Dead Redemption 2 either. It's pin sharp, looks great, and ray trace shadows are enabled to boot on both sides. Now, RT shadows mainly appear in the environment from sun cast shadows. You'll see outlines of trees swaying with far more accuracy across the ground at range compared to the non-RT option. Alas, this combo of 4K and ray tracing does come at a cost. Fidelity mode runs with a 30 FPS cap. At 30 FPS, it ends up feeling quite similar to the PS4 version, and honestly, it does feel more sluggish to control as a result, especially compared to the other 60 FPS modes. Next up, if we switch over, is the Performance RT mode. Impressively, ray trace shadows are still enabled here, keeping the improved definition to shadows at range. The real draw in Performance RT mode, on PS5 and Series X, it runs at a fluid 60 FPS target, and immediately you can feel the difference in our bike ride here. It's easily my recommended way to play. The cost? Well, 60 FPS is surprisingly well met, but resolution gets downgraded to a native 1440p on both machines. Still, even with that downgrade, the game's temporal anti-aliasing resolves a pleasant, if no longer pin-sharp image here. It's a good trade-off, I think, and again, it's highly recommended. Lastly, we have a regular performance mode, no RT in the title. Again, this runs at a native 1440p based on our testing on both PS5 and Series X, but yes, you guessed it, this mode disables ray tracing in a bid to try run at 60fps with fewer drops. Are there any differences between PS5 and Series X though? Actually yes, though they're often quite subtle. It's nitpick territory. As ever, there's variability in how Rockstar's engine presents on each playthrough. Dynamic systems like crowds, car dispersion, weather, time of day, all of these skew comparisons so easily. But thankfully, a few missions at the start of the game sync up all these elements closely, and in broad strokes we can see all textures, lighting quality, effects and draw distances are matched between PS5 and Series X. Regardless of mode, there's little to really split the two, except there is one bizarre difference. Check this out in example. In this shot, PS5 renders an extra shadow under the car here. It's not an outlier either, this happens across the entire game world. Time of day is matched in this case, which helps make it stand out. It also happens regardless of mode, fidelity, performance RT, or performance. In every case, an extra shadow is cast on the cars or where a character's foot hits the ground on PS5. So after a bit of digging, it turns out environmental shadows and ambient occlusion are in fact matched between PS5 and Series X. What we're actually seeing here under the car on PS5 is instead what appears to be a kind of projected shadow texture. This is a technique used by Rockstar that's separate to the SSAO pass or typical shadows, essentially drawing a texture to bake in shade at these points. But yes, whether it's a bug or a simple oversight, it appears to be missing on Xbox Series X right now. And to stress, again, actual shadow quality and SSAO are identical in quality between PS5 and Series X otherwise. There's a second difference too, another nitpick really, in reflections, this time favouring Xbox Series X. It appears Series X uses a higher settings for cube-mapped reflections on car bodies. At least in select moments like this shot of Franklin's supercar, you get a sharper definition on Series X. It's curious to note it only appears in the non-RT performance mode, and also most later scenes show little to no difference as well. Otherwise, PS5 and Series X are very closely paired in settings, even to the point that, sadly, texture filtering quality is poor even in this enhanced edition. See how down this road, both consoles use a very low-grade anisotropic filtering setting that just ends up blurring past a few meters. Even on the 4K fidelity mode, where you'd expect the best case, there's just no way to brute force past it, which is a bit of a shame honestly. For every other point, the two are ostensibly a match though. Okay, last up, are there any other differences between the three modes? I'm using PS5 in example here, though all of this applies to Series X too. Obviously, the bump to 4K in the fidelity mode is a huge plus, next to the 1440p in the two performance modes. And yes, the 60fps for those latter performance modes stands out for any driving, any real action. The ray trace shadows also shine in the fidelity and performance RT modes just as you'd expect. Environmental shadows cast by the sun get a huge upgrade. In practice though, for core settings in GTA 5, in draw distances, textures, texture filtering, geometry, everything is tightly matched. Often the only real discrepancy in these shots is in shadows, which tend to vary in side by side simply because of the rolling time of day. Ultimately, the differences between the three modes boil down to three areas: resolution, frame rate, and whether ray tracing is enabled. That being said, there's one extra perk of the fidelity mode. On top of using a 4K image, cube-mapped reflections run at a higher resolution than the other two modes. Check out this building side. It's using a higher setting to almost suit the 4K presentation. PS5 and Series X are closely tied then, but does the performance hold up? To start with the performance RT mode with a 60fps target, PS5 and Series X absolutely deliver here. From the first 5 hours of play, I've got to say it, it's a perfect 60fps in performance RT mode on both sides, no problem, though of course there are a few exceptional moments. During missions, especially the explosive stuff with Trevor, we get more significant drops into the 50 FPS and occasionally the 40 FPS region. Anything involving explosions or vehicle physics taxes both PS5 and Series X. In free roaming the city, you're also able to force frame rate drops, if you'd like, just by starting a shootout with lots of cars on the road. Hardly out of the ordinary in GTA, and inevitably this drops harder the more you congest the roads. But I've got to say the regular missions don't show many issues in frame rate 99% of the time, besides a handful of small moments. This goes for PS5 here, but also Series X. Which is better then? Curiously, both PS5 and Series X drop in different areas to differing extremes in the performance RT mode. The Mr. Phillips mission, for example, where Trevor goes on a kind of rampage, has PS5 take a hit to almost the 40 FPS line. It's a stark, visible drop in an otherwise 60 FPS experience, making the oncoming bikers look choppy as they approach. On Xbox Series X though, this very same view of the explosion hovers at around the 50 FPS line instead, a significant lead. But then we see the reverse case in other missions. Blowing up this car during Franklin's mission, for example, again drops Series X to that 50 FPS point on the graph for as long as the wreckage is in view. A surprise considering it's just one vehicle. Moving back to PS5 though, well, the line doesn't even go under 60 in this case. It's hard then to call a definitive lead in the performance RT mode, but the bottom line is yes, both are capable of drops under 60 FPS, though never too long to disrupt the experience. The next question then, does the regular non-RT performance mode fix these drops under 60 FPS? Does it have a purpose? By switching ray tracing off and sticking to a similar 1440p presentation, are PS5 and Series X at a locked 60 now? The blunt answer is, well, not completely, but it certainly helps. The Mr. Phillips mission with Trevor, for example, now only drops briefly to the 55 FPS line on PS5 during that explosion. Most other missions though, which previously showed a drop under 60 FPS, are now completely tightened up at 60 FPS on PS5, which is great news, and gives the performance mode some reason to exist. Switching over to Series X, the results are also improved. The trailer explosion during Mr. Phillips' mission hits 55 FPS again, but for a longer sustained period than PS5. Later shootouts with Trevor also still drop to the 50s on Series X, where PS5 runs at 60 in the performance mode. So, oddly enough, there are some rare drops remaining on Series X which aren't an issue on PS5, but in general, performance mode tightens up GTA 5's frame rate on both sides nicely. Last up is the 4K 30 frames per second fidelity mode. I've got to say it, the game is really robust on PS5 and Series X at 30 FPS here. You'll be hitting this 30 FPS line almost everywhere you go, sticking to the missions anyway. And even forcing a car pileup in the city streets, it holds reasonably well at that target. More cars, more explosions will drop it under the line of course, but the sky's the limit there. In practical gameplay, for missions, there's just one sub 30 FPS drop in my testing. No surprise here, it's that Mr. Phillips mission again, and for PS5 this explosion results in a sustained drop to almost the 20 FPS line. Now normal play eventually resumes, but it's a glaring drop, and tellingly through it all, the resolution never changes from 4K. You have to wonder if DRS would have been a good idea for these moments. Thankfully, switching to the Series X version, we see this spot is at least better on the fidelity mode, dropping to just 27 FPS for a spell. And for the rest of gameplay, outside of this mission, it's again a perfect 30 FPS lock on Series X. Grand Theft Auto 5's new enhanced release does a lot to impress. The 4K image, the 60 FPS modes, the ray trace shadows, even the haptics and the adaptive triggers on PS5 are worth using, adding genuine weight to the game's shooting mechanics here. From a pure visual perspective, PS5 and Series X are hard to split apart otherwise though. The frame rate leads are interchangeable. Depending on which mode you use, which mission you're playing, either PS5 or Series X will drop a little harder or further. But in performance RT mode, they're too rare to be an issue overall, and this is our mode of choice. As for visual comparisons, it also says a lot that the main difference is Series X is missing shadows under cars which are present on PS5. The contrast ends there though. Draw distances, world detail, physics, ray trace shadow quality, it's all essentially matched between the two. On balance then, you can't go too far wrong with either version. We'll be back of course with a look at the Series S version in due course, but right now, you have to wonder what else might have been possible in a next-gen GTA 5 package. The lack of ray trace reflections is a shame, definitely, but going with RT shadows at least mirrors CDPR's efforts with Cyberpunk on PS5 and Series X. The 3 modes are pretty curious too, given they appear to run at fixed resolution targets like 1440p or 4K. Having DRS might have opened the gates for better image quality, above 1440p in the performance mode for example, where GPU headroom allowed it. The big success of GTA 5 on PS5 and Series X though, at last allowing 60fps for the first time on console. Seriously, it's a game changer, and even at 1440p, it's hard to go back to the 30fps of the fidelity mode. Let's be honest though, it's not exactly the generational leap we'd hoped for, especially given it's not a free upgrade. But if you've not played GTA 5 before or just want to revisit after all these years, both PS5 and Series X now offer the best ways to play the game on console so far. But that's all I've got for now. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.